Good morning.
Good morning.
Nice to see everyone. Looks like you're excited about repentance.
Yes.
When I was a boy, and it would always happen when I was homesick in the spring, they would be playing the old reruns of Charlton Heston playing in these Jesus movies, like coming up to Easter. And I think he played John the Baptist. And there's a scene where he's being jailed, and he's repent, sinner, your bed is on fire. He's yelling at Pontius Pilate. So good morning. I was raised Catholic, so I have some of these impressions in my mind. I'll talk about it this morning a little bit. Well, I'm going to talk about what we normally translate as atonement. Sometimes we use the word repent, sometimes other types of translations, but I'd like to talk about that this morning. And that's for a couple reasons. One is that we have a Fusatsu ceremony coming up on Tuesday, which throughout most of the year, each month on the night of the full moon, we have an atonement ceremony. So I want to set up a little bit about what that practice is. And really, Reverend Oriana brought this to my attention and said, "Oh, wouldn't it be great to have a talk about that and some things that you work with? I know at the hospital, when you're working with people, sometimes there are questions about what's forgiveness, and those kind of things come up a lot. And it's really ripe. It's very ripe in our spiritual life. And I think probably when you're in those acute situations, people start to think about those things more strongly. And what is a Buddhist approach to that? I was thinking about it a little bit that this summer I've been giving some talks about the liberation of wisdom, about this practice of the paramitas. And the second paramita is the paramita of ethics, or paramita of sila, morality, sometimes we translate it. And really part and parcel of that practice is this practice of atonement. If we're going to try to live a life from a Buddhist perspective, a moral life, we need the capacity to be able to atone for mistakes that we've made, okay? For places which we are out of alignment. And Buddhism has a particular way of thinking about that. And it's a little bit tricky because many of us, not all of us, but many of us who would sit in this hall today, you grew up probably in Abrahamic religion, just talking statistics here, and it's likely that you also grew up in a Christian environment, or at least a household, but at least an environment. Whether you did or not, you're within a culture which is largely defined by those dynamics. So it doesn't mean you needed to be, like I mentioned, I was raised Catholic, and so I have certain kinds of, shapes of my way of conceiving of things that comes from Catholicism. In my case, I usually tell people I think I got just the right amount. I feel pretty good about it. I know a lot of people, they feel kind of injured by being raised in the Catholic Church. So you have your own experience with that. But even aside from that, we have a whole culture which is informed by a certain way of thinking about sin, about mistake, and what does it mean to cop to it? What does it mean to be forgiven? Or what does it mean to be able to move forward? And so in that vein, I think it's important to start a little bit with what is the dominant view of the place we are in, which would definitely be an Abrahamic, particularly Christian viewpoint. Because it's so different than Buddhism, it can be important for us to clarify what is that, so that we can see that we're not just slipping into those patterns of thinking when we're trying to practice some kind of Buddhist practice. Now, that's not to say those religions or those ways of conceiving are wrong or bad or anything. I don't have no opinion about that. Really, literally. I have had opinions about that. But it's just not so interesting to me to have an opinion about that. Actually, my opinion will be about what is there to do. And for me, that centers around a Buddhist understanding. Also, I would say, before I get into this a little bit, anything a person says about any religion, if you go into that religion, there'll be people who agree with it and people who totally disagree with it. So if you bring up anything theological, there'll be theologians who will argue to the hilt, like this, and then 180 degrees will be a different mindset. So I'm just presenting here a kind of general mindset, and that's a general mindset that there is a creator God. Very different than in Buddhism. Buddhism doesn't say there's a creator God. It says there might be a God that created this particular universe that we're in right now, but that's not really what's most important. Okay? So in a way of thinking about a creator God that gives a law to the chosen beings, which are humans, which they enter into a covenant with, and that covenant is a covenant of salvation for obeying the law. Okay, that's the foundational mythology of Abrahamic faiths. And so obedience to that law is how we can, if we use more maybe Buddhist language, harmonize with the mind of God. And if you could harmonize with the mind of God, then that would be a kind of liberation, or that would be a salvation. That would assure you a place in a peaceful, everlasting world. And so the focus in this way of conceiving of things is, what is the law? What are the rules? What is right and wrong? How could we determine that? Well, the basic answer is God reveals it, right? And then when God reveals that, then you can work accordingly. Right? So we have the 10 Commandments, which now are in some classroom walls, apparently, in some states. They were a lot before, and then got taken out. I've had mixed feelings about all that, by the way. So I'm not just, a little religion in the schools might not be bad, but I want it to be my religion. That might be the rub. But this is kind of a basic framework. When we get to Christianity, which again lays a foundation for much of our spiritual outlook of things, even if we didn't grow up in that faith, we're affected by it in a lot of ways, or it creates what I've been talking about, the ultimate frame, the place from which we look, the kind of assumptions that make up the kind of foundation of how it is that we're approaching anything. So you're definitely, even if you didn't grow up in Christianity, you're going to have part of that in your gut probably. And so in this case, the way that you overcome the sin is not through your own effort, it's through a sacrifice, the sacrifice of Jesus, the Lamb of God. I heard that so much when I was in church, and I remember that's part of your recitation of the Creed of Faith. The Lamb of God takes away the sins of the world. Right? So the Lamb of God is the sacrifice. The lamb, they're so cute, right? And so fluffy, and you think, oh, this is great. It's all pure. The lamb's pure. Well, the lamb gets killed. Okay? That's part of the deal. And the lamb gets killed and sacrificed, and that's how you overcome sin. Right? So this idea that repentance or forgiveness came through a sacrifice, but it's a sacrifice that God gave of himself in the flesh of the person of Jesus, and that's where you will be forgiven for your transgressions. And so in that kind of way of understanding it, the way that you overcome your transgressions is to accept that grace of God that came through the person of Jesus. And by accepting Jesus into your heart, then you would overcome all manner of sin. Again, many theologians would argue about that in a different way, but that's a basic dynamic that you can see. There's a lot of emphasis on the world being intrinsically corrupt. There's no way that God could really survive the world on the world's terms, so that the sacrifice becomes necessary. The ascendancy of the divine is our goal, and our capacity to ascend with the divine is kind of the goal of salvation. That's why you want to get over your sin. That's why you want to atone. That's why you want to repent, so that you can ascend in the proper way. Right? And churches are shaped like this. So this is a general kind of principle. Again, I'm not judging it. I'm just kind of giving a very cartoonish sketch of what that's like, so that we can compare it a little bit to a Buddhist teaching. If we look at the Buddhist teaching or Buddhist cosmology is not founded around a creator God. The cosmology, in its most basic sense, would talk about cause and effect. That all things come about not through creation, so to speak, but through causes, conditions, and the effects of those causes and conditions. And that there is a cyclical quality to any kind of existence that's coming from the interplay of those causes and conditions continuously. Now, this is true of many South Asian religions. This is the kind of basic operating principle. Sometimes they will point out a creator God, but the creator God is a creator God of cycles. You know, like Brahma is sleeping, and out of Brahma's belly button grows a lotus flower, and then opens, and then there. Or no, maybe it's Vishnu, and Brahma's sitting in the lotus, and then there's a baby Brahma, and then every time the baby opens his eyes, a whole cosmos comes into existence, and as he shuts his eyes, the whole cosmos ceases and opens his eye, and the whole cosmos unfolds. So we're somewhere in one of those, one of those blinks. It's usually that kind of understanding, and that the cause and effect that's happening within that cosmos is what we can study about the truth of that divine, that kind of divine being. So this comes out of South Asia, where Buddha taught, and so it's part of the texture of the way that people were conceiving of the world. The Buddha really focused on cause and effect, and said, yeah, maybe there's gods that do this, or maybe they do that, but I don't really want to talk about it so much. In fact, oftentimes when the Buddha Shakyamuni was faced with a cosmological question, he would say, I don't want to go into too much detail there. Not because we couldn't, or not because it's never important, but because, did you notice that there's an arrow sticking out of your side, and that you're in pain, and that you're poisoned by that arrow? Really what you want to do is work on that now, and don't worry so much about who made the bow, and who fletched the arrow, and where did the poison get constructed, okay? So that was usually the Buddha's response to those kind of cosmological questions. But we should be careful there, because if we just say, oh, cosmology doesn't matter, then what you'll do is you'll just use the cosmology that's below your threshold of awareness. Okay? So you have a cosmology. You have a way of looking at the universe, an assumption about how things are. Definitely you do. Everyone does. And so if you don't go a little bit into the cosmological thinking about it, you'll just use whatever's there. You'll use what you're imprinted with. So I actually say, yeah, think a little bit about cosmology, I'm also not the Buddha, so maybe I have to do a little bit lower work. So in the Buddhism, this cause and effect becomes one of the defining characteristics of the nature of the cosmological discussions. And the Buddha doesn't want to talk too much about how this all get made. Okay? And he says, how is it made in this moment? How is it that the phenomena that I encounter moment after moment appear? That becomes more the focus of the Buddhist teaching. And the moral imperative that comes from that is a moral imperative that is about karma. It's about wholesome karma and unwholesome karma, and karma that's neutral, and karma that overcomes karma. Mm-hmm. So this discussion about how is it that I am in the world, how is it that I do things in the world, body, speech, mind, heart, that creates the world that I live in. And it's not a kind of like idea that the whole world is just in your mind, although there's some kinds of Buddhism that focus a little bit in that direction, but basically saying we're totally involved in whatever it is that we're experiencing, and we need to pay attention to that. Yeah. Now, a kind of fine point in this is that we oftentimes think of karma as baggage. And I said a couple weeks ago, I sort of said that, right? I was like, we think we just got to carry on, but actually, a carry-on in one checked piece, but we actually have houses and houses full of baggage. And so sometimes it's convenient to use that kind of term, like karma is something that you're carrying. Right? But we have to be a little bit careful of that way of talking about it. In a technical sense, karma isn't something we're carrying. Karma is us. So the way that you're experiencing the world, the way you conceive of who you are, the way you see things, those experiences is marked by karma, or we could say that we are seeing a formation of phenomena which we're participating in according to the law of cause and effect, one of which is the cause and effect of intention, or the moral cause and effect, sometimes people would call it. So the way you think about things, the way you intend towards them, the way you approach them, the way you treat them, will unfold in some patterns that you can see into. And when you see into them, you have the capacity to shift them. Or you have the capacity to receive some teaching or some grace or some compassion from a bodhisattva or Buddha that helps those to shift. Right? And that becomes more the focus of what's happening. In Mahayana Buddhism particularly, in the same way that in like an Abrahamic faith, particularly Christianity, there may be emphasis on ascendancy, like the world's pretty screwed up, you need to get saved. That exists in Buddhism too. Like the world is samsara. The world is pretty screwed up, not likely to stop being that way. And then there's posited this state of being called nirvana, which is quiet and peaceful and joyous and true in a way that samsara isn't. Some schools of Buddhism emphasize we need to move from samsara to nirvana. Mahayana Buddhism as a whole, the Zen schools especially, emphasize that nirvana and samsara are the same place. They're the same place. And the way in which you are and the way in which you live becomes what is defined as nirvana or samsara. Right? It's not a different place. It's the way, how you play the game. It's going to make a big difference in how it is that's experienced. So when we talk about these teachings of karma within the Mahayana schools particularly, there's an emphasis not on getting out of here or getting away from or being pure, the stain being purified so you can enter into this other state. It's like, no, what's the ground of being which we're all sharing? And that's why repentance or atonement is necessary, is to find our way to that ground, not to kind of get around or get past our difficulties. Now we chant, we do this on Sunday morning, and there's other times we do it as well, but on Sunday mornings the first thing we chant is called the Atonement verse, or sometimes verse of repentance. All my past and harmful karma, born from beginningless greed, hate, and delusion, through body, speech, and mind, I now fully avow. Yeah, that's a gatha, which is like a 4-line kind of poem, which is used for practice. So we use this as a kind of a prayer or a kind of a thing that can be intoned, which help us to understand more deeply what is this practice of atonement. Then we also have ceremonies like the one I mentioned, the Fusatsu ceremony. But anything that we do ritually or ceremonially is to help teach us about what is the fundamental spirit or what is the fundamental practice of coming back to that atonement again and again to find our way back to the ground. Now you'll notice in this verse, we are atoning for our harmful karma. There's also positive karma. Karma that leads towards liberation, creates the conditions that makes it easier for people to unbind the suffering of the world. That's what is called wholesome karma. And so we're encouraged. Karma in and of itself is not bad, but we want to atone for the harmful karma. Eventually, though, Buddhism will say that even the wholesome karma is limited. It's not liberation. It's wholesome because it creates the conditions for us to practice in another way, a liberating type of way. And we talk about that. We talked about that a little bit when we were talking about the paramitas, but that's a lot of Buddhist practices pointing at that third way, where we're trying to just purify karma in its most direct sense through a kind of non-intention. But I want to put that aside just for a second. Okay? So wholesome karma, liberating karma, really what we're atoning for is the harmful karma. And it's born from beginningless greed, hate, and delusion. This beginningless is important. That cyclical thing that I was talking about, the cosmology, the conception of what is a world, it's not like it started somewhere. In Buddhism, there is no Garden of Eden. Okay? We didn't get kicked out of anything. This has just been like this. This is kind of how it is, right? And Mara, the deceptor's got a really long life, and he keeps a lot of things turning in the Buddhist mythology, right? That we're like, well, couldn't I just get this for myself and screw everybody else? Like those little things that are keeping this whole wheel going. And you grow up in that environment, and then you learn that. You learn these kind of deceptive ways of living, and that wheel keeps on going. It didn't start anywhere. Okay. This is really liberating and can also at certain places be overwhelming because you can't locate the cause. Oftentimes the way we want to solve problems is locating the cause. In very, very few situations does that actually solve the problem. Broken bones is pretty good, right? What's the cause of my pain? The bone is broken. reset the bone, it fixes it. That's a law of cause and effect, which is called biology. Okay? When it comes to moral cause and effect, it's very rare that we find something in which just finding the cause of it could be isolated in a way that you could say something about. If you look at even people who do horrible things and you look into the karma that is their life, you will see that they're not playing that game alone. There's all kinds of cause and effect that's moving through that being. It's there. This understanding is there to engender compassion, right? Not judgment. But sometimes we think like, well, if there's no beginning to it, then there's no end to it. What am I going to, what's the hope for us? That's the overwhelming part. Okay, it comes through our body, it comes through our speech, it comes through our mind. I think this is really important. Oftentimes we think just immorality or something we need to atone for is only coming from our thoughts, or the thoughts are really the basis of it. Buddhism says, no, karma runs through your body, it runs through your mind, it runs through your speech, runs through your heart. It is you in a lot of ways. And so you don't just try to isolate it in one place. Realize that it's coming through all manner of your being. And that our work is to avow it, to atone it, to acknowledge it. Really the term Sangha, which is how atonement is spoken of in Japanese, which is a translation and transliteration of a Sanskrit term called kshana, means something, or kshama, it means something like to acknowledge and to regret. Now, the acknowledgement comes from an ancient practice in which particularly the renunciant community lived under a set of rules. Those rules governed all the behavior of the renunciate community. And so twice a month, they would gather, and there was an opportunity to cop to the rules you hadn't kept. And there was only 3 rules that would get you kicked out of the community. But the other ones you might be asked to mostly you just had to admit to it. Well, a lot of the rules are things like wash your bowl. Okay, so they don't all carry what we would think of as like a big moral weight. Remember, killing a human, having sexual intercourse with a human. Remember, they're renunciates, so that's one of the vows that they take. And notice I'm being very precise about it. Having sexual intercourse with a human is what got you kicked out of the community. That was very specific. I think they just felt like we can't and it wasn't so like you're so bad that you have to be kicked out of the community. It was like the practical, how do we maintain the community? If you're having sexual intercourse with other humans, there's going to be babies involved. Who's going to take care of the babies, So killing other humans, like you just need to have a hard, fast, red line. That's what we call those these days, right? A red line around that one. And then the last one, this one is really the one that always perks my attention a little bit. Lying about your spiritual attainments. Okay? If you have a community of renunciates who are seen as leaders, spiritual leaders, and they go around lying about what their spiritual status is, you're going to have a big problem. So those are the 3 that really were like ended in that kind of thing. The others, they were really about how do we hold people in a way that they can mature past this karma. And one of the things that was seen as key to that was that people acknowledge their own misdeeds. Now, if you have a set of rules, in a way it's a lot easier, because you can think through, rule 233, I was supposed to fold my robe this way, I didn't fold my robe this way before I put it away, and I could feel the truth of that. Probably you don't notice. That was part of the reason for those rules, is to require you to notice things that you wouldn't notice. And then you notice like, I'm not taking care of my robe in the way I'm supposed to. I'm not understanding its importance in my life and in life as total. And so there's something off. There's some negative karma associated with that. I first need to admit that negative karma. Okay? And then I can work with it in a way. It's very powerful, actually. Now, that practice, which was associated with those particular rules, has transformed in different ways in the way that it comes to us in the practice of fusatsu, or just the reading of this verse, or the state of your own heart in which you're continually thinking about what is the contraction of unwholesome karma, and how do I become more and more sensitive to that. So in that large practice of Sangha that can happen on all those different levels, in the form of Buddhism that we practice, we don't have a list of rules. Very, very few of us are renunciates. And myself included, I'm not a renunciate. So we don't have those very specific rules that dictate every part of how you're living. You have to develop another kind of sensitivity about that unwholesome karma. So part of the practice of Sangha is simply developing that sensitivity. Being able to study sila or study ethics more deeply requires the development of that kind of sensitivity. No one's going to give you a list. Even with that list for the renunciates, that was not their total study of an ethical life. That was just what you had to do if you were a renunciate. Those were like the social rules of being a renunciate. You still had to cultivate this more and more subtle understanding of what is it to be ethical. Yeah. So the atonement doesn't just help us escape; it brings us down to the ground. Okay, how are you? So one of my favorite quotes, I know I always say that when I quote something, I have lots of favorites. It used to bug me, my wife she would say, oh, what's your favorite color? And I would say, like when we were teenagers, when we were dating, I'd say, I don't know, favorite's so like exclusionary or whatever, and she just had no problem with it. She was, I love red. And the next day we'll be like, I love blue. And just no problem, just like having a favorite. So I picked up that habit. Today, my favorite quote, and Dogen-zenji, the founder of this school, quoted this in a text called INMO in his grand work called the Shobogenzo. And in there he quotes, this is an ancient quote that's attributed to Brahma. Brahma, the high god, is trying to convert Mara. Okay, Mara is the deceiver. He's always troublemaker, creating a lot of unwholesome karma. And so in the mythological recordings of this, it said that Brahma's trying to convert Mara. And he says to Mara, if one falls down because of the ground, one gets up because of the ground. If one seeks to get up apart from the ground, it will never be possible. If one falls down because of the ground, one gets up because of the ground. If one seeks to get up apart from the ground, it will never be possible. Now, in the way he quotes it here, he's not particularly talking about atonement, but I think this is exactly a very pithy presentation of what is Buddhist atonement about. The weight of being is part of the thing. We're not trying to get away from the weight of being. We're not trying to get out of here. We're saying, no, being is important and it has a weight, it has a responsibility. And how do I transfer that weight down to the ground? How do I walk on that ground? How do I stand on that ground? Kyogen Carlson Roshi, who's one of the founders of Dharma Rain Zen Center in Portland, an important person in the founding of this temple, I always love, he used to say, gravity treats everyone exactly the same. And you can fall down the stairs, or you can glide down the stairs. Really different experience. Yeah? You can dance, you can fall. And if you live a really full life, you'll do both. You'll fall down sometimes, you'll glide sometimes, you'll dance sometimes. But if you pay attention in that falling down, there's a real opportunity. And what we know when we fall down, even though that oftentimes hurts, it usually takes some suffering in the acknowledgement of our falling down. Now, one other thing I like about this falling down business is your intention might not have been so bad, right? Like oftentimes we think it's all about like, well, I didn't mean to do it, right? And it's like, yeah, but you did. That counts as unwholesome, right? And at the same time, sometimes we're beating ourselves up so much because we think like, well, if I did this horrible thing, I must be a horrible person. My intention must just be permanently stained. But actually Buddhism says, no. When you feel the pain of the ground, that's the effect of the cause of how you were thinking about it. It doesn't mean that you are doomed to think about things that way, feel about things that way, or to approach things that way. You're not doomed. You're not stuck in that. You don't have to be stuck in that. That you can actually change that. And the recognition in hitting the ground that something's off is a very important place for us figuring out what it means to stand up. one of the things we could ask ourselves about all this is, what is freedom? If you think freedom is getting away from all of the responsibilities of life, then this kind of like taking off business is pretty good. Mm-hmm. But that's not what Buddhism teaches. Buddhism teaches that freedom is an embeddedness within these causes and conditions, and then our job as beings who are trying to travel the way of awakening is to see all of those causes and conditions as an opportunity for skillful means, for the possibility of transformation. So we don't want to escape the gravity of things. We don't want to escape things themselves. We want to say, oh, I need to work with this in a little bit different way. It's not so different than screwing up your knee, which I did on Friday. So it's fresh on my mind. I was taking a prostration. I've been having a little problem on my right side, so I was kind of using my, my right side, so I was using my left side a little bit too much. And you know how you do that? And then if you go to a doctor, they're like, don't do that too much, because then you're going to break the other side. And then I did a little bit. So I was going down for prostration, and then something went, and then I was like, oh, okay, great. So, but why am I bringing that up? Because this is an opportunity to learn to care about your body. It'd be better if I didn't. Don't get me wrong. I wish I hadn't. It doesn't seem to be too bad. But now I don't get to go back and change that. But what I can say is, okay, what's happening here? And one of the things that it brings about, and you may experience this when you injure yourself or when you get sick, is tenderness. You're like, oh, okay, actually, tenderness is required here. Compassion is required. Some other way of thinking about my life than just fixing myself becomes necessary to be present with this pain, which is now hopefully teaching me about how it is that I need to live. We have a saying in Zen Buddhism that cause and effect are one suchness. That oftentimes we split apart the cause and effect. We say they're kind of this thing, and that's true. You act like a jerk to somebody, and then a couple days later, you get an angry email, or when you see them next time, they frown at you, or more likely, you're a jerk to someone, and a couple days later, you realize you were a jerk, and you feel bad about it. It can be any of those things are effects, but we kind of think that they're separate, right? That there's a cause and there's an effect. But Zen Buddhism particularly will emphasize that no, the cause and the effect, there's no separation between the two. They're never separated. That at the moment that you're a jerk to somebody, that's the technical term, the moment that you're a jerk to somebody, there's a contraction. The karma is already sown. There's not like the effects happening later. The effects happening right there. You might not notice it till later. It might not come into the threshold of consciousness or experience until later, but that it's right at that moment. And I think this is a really important teaching. Part of the reason it's teaching is a lot of times we get a little confused about how to work with this morality of cause and effect. One of the examples that gets brought up sometimes is our thought about effort. Okay? We think effort should bring about good results as operationally defined as what we want, right? I mean, isn't that how you think about effort, right? The operationally defined definition of good results is that what I want, and that's why I'm making the effort, and that's how we effort things. But this teaching says no. The effect of effort is growth, and you can't actually know what that growth is going to be, right? Now you could aim it in a certain direction, and you should, right? But if you're only thinking in those terms of cause and effect as being separated like that, little bit of misunderstanding can start to flow into the way that you're working with these things. So one of the ways that we work with that in Zen Buddhism in particular is right through the practice of Zazen. Really, all practices have this, but the practice of Zazen is a very, very direct way to study this. That as we're practicing meditation, that we're not just trying to produce a good result. We're not trying to get over things we feel bad about. We're not trying to just produce a kind of good experience, although that often happens, I guarantee you, and is part of the deal, but we don't want to effort towards that good result. What we actually want to do is come to the ground. The ground is this non-separation of cause and effect, because right on that ground, in the moment that our heart, mind, body speech in our head, we're not usually talking during meditation, as it takes a turn, the effect of whatever that turn is immediate. And we can see into that more clearly in the practice of meditation. So meditation becomes about shifting our orientation, about harmonizing with, about learning to stand up on that ground that has its own gravity, has its own way of being with that law of cause and effect. We can study it there just very, very directly, rather than always just looking for the results. Now, results are also important to pay attention to, even if they're way out here somewhere, right? But this is a way that we can come in very close. And I think part of the reason I'm bringing this up is this is difficult. And when you're right up against having done something that you really regret, it is excruciating. When you really regret it, it's excruciating. And the acknowledgement of it is not the escape from it. The acknowledgement is the starting of the possibility to work with the karma in a different way. And that's what atonement is that acknowledgement so we can work with it in a different way. It doesn't take us out of the situation or off of the ground. It requires us to be there in another way. The good news about that is there is an unbelievable amount of compassion and grace in that place. And I think that sometimes, if I try to interpret Christianity, which I do sometimes, I think, that's really what they're talking about. That's what the saving power of atonement and the grace of God is about. Is about there is that place in which forgiveness is possible. It's just that the forgiveness, in a Buddhist sense, is coming from our willingness to really be present with the non-separation of the cause and the effect. That I really do regret. And when you really regret there, actually, forgiveness isn't really where you should put your mind. Standing up, paying attention is where you should put your mind. And that's where the compassion comes in. And we can build cultures of that. So that's one of the things that's important in a Buddhist community, that we build a culture of that kind of holding. And that's part of also what the Fusatsu ceremony is about, that we're willing to acknowledge these are things that I've wronged everyone, ways that I've done something harmful. And as we do that, then a culture of that kind of compassion and caring happens. And the thing about compassion is sometimes it can be really strict. And it's not always, let me help you over your troubled waters. Sometimes the compassion is, no, I'll stay here with you. And boy, this is hard, isn't it? Sometimes like that. Any questions or words?
So the precept of not discussing faults has been really sticky with me for a while.
Does that one suck?
It does.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit how not discussing faults and atoning for your faults come together and
Yeah. So if we use the word fault and we think about like what are we doing when we're faulting something, is we're trying to pin down the origin of the problem, oftentimes in an external way, but then also in an internal way. That's why I don't translate it as not discussing the faults of others, which is a very common translation, but actually in the Chinese it just says not discussing faults, which would include like your own and all the discussion that happens in your head about that. So so that kind of let's say like a intention to try to solve the problem by pinning down the blame. That's the not discussing faults. That's why that's a problem, because we're trying to actually kind of get out of the situation by assigning blame somewhere. That's why the assigning the blame to yourself is so like doesn't work. But we do it anyway, and there's a lot of reasons for that we could play with. But we want to just resolve the situation. It's easier to be bad than to have just done something bad in which you have responsibility for. Right? So that's the thing. In atonement, we're not trying to find the fault. In fact, when we atone from something, the practice of that is simply is simply your own like review of what you've been doing and places where you feel that kind of contraction of harmful karma, and then saying, yeah, I've done that. And oftentimes it's not my fault in the sense that I made it up and started about it. I didn't yell at kids because I grew up in an environment where there was no yelling at kids. I yelled at kids because that's how you do it, right? You want them to hear you and follow your instruction. You know, you get kind of big and you growl, right? Not so skillful, pretty harmful, right? But it didn't start with me. It's not my fault, but it also is my responsibility. And that's the delineation between it when you're working with the karma. But it can be really hard because we have these patterns of thinking about it, particularly the patterns that kind of like, my soul is stained in some way, or I'm bad in some way. And that's a part which I think Buddhism offers us another model to work with, but we don't just go, okay, I'm going to go with that model now. No, because your whole insides are structured in this way that is has these other patterns. So it's a process of uncovering those and realizing, oh, okay, actually, there's nothing here to blame, but there is responsibility to take. And when I can take the responsibility, all of the conditions and causes that flow into my own unskillfulness are also can be transformed. That's not just about some bad person. Yeah.
So what's coming up for me, what's a really deep part of my own internal cosmology, I guess, and also really a big part of our culture is the notion of sacrifice. And I struggle with that a lot, and I think there's a lot of layers to it. But the piece that kind of caught my ear when you were talking is that sacrifice has an aspect of it is that efforting towards something. I mean, think simple things like saving for retirement. You sacrifice the present so that you have a future. Parenting. You sacrifice for your children so they can have what you don't have. All these kinds of things. It's been a huge part of my life. But I was just curious about how this. You talked about rather than the efforting part, but bringing it back to the ground. And I'm not really remembering it exactly how you said it, but I'm just kind of curious how sacrifice does or does not relate to that.
Yeah. So maybe a place to start would be to see a big difference in the way of practice. In Buddhism, generally speaking, there's no sacrifices. There are some burning of fingers at stupas that happen in some sutras. Very rare. Okay? But it's hard. That seems more like sacrifice, but it also is an offering, a burnt offering. But really in Buddhism, we focus on... that's what they're called. We really focus on offerings. And if you just think about what is the difference between thinking about bringing something forward as an offering and bringing it as a sacrifice. It could be playing with semantics a little bit, and you'd have to go back to the different words that were used in languages where maybe something got translated as sacrifice and something as an offering. But you will see largely in Buddhism, when you're bringing together an offering, you're burning incense, you're offering food, offering tea, you're saying, let's bring together, let's nourish this Buddha mind, or let's nourish this awakening beings, which I am also a part of, and let those be the way in which we move forward, as opposed to, I screwed up, I'm going to sacrifice this thing to cleanse my
beat
mistake.
Myself up, which is
or beat myself up. Yeah,
that's another way to sacrifice.
Yeah, exactly. So we have a lot of that, and then I think it does turn into, when we're facing our own shortcomings or places where we've made mistakes or something, then beating ourselves up or sacrificing or repenting becomes about a certain kind of inflicting pain upon ourselves to overcome, and that's like a show of our faith or something. This is really different than, generally speaking, the Buddhist way, where in the Buddhist way you're just learning to try to act in a different way, and then forbear the effects of your negative karma. That's one of the big things. So, of course, there's a very famous story of Angulimala that I've told many times, who was a bandit that killed people and cut off their fingers and made a mala, like you have a mala of beads that you might say a mantra on or something. Well, Anguli means finger. So he had a mala of fingers. That was his name. He became a disciple of the Buddha, very important. one, and when Angulimala would go on his begging rounds, and the people would throw rocks at him, right? They'd beat him up. And he went back to the Buddha and said, well, I become a renunciate, I gave up all of that, and he said, yeah, but there's still karma moving, right? And so the forbearance that he pointed Angulimala to was really important. Now, of course, it's an extreme case, and mythologies give us extreme cases on purpose, so we can look at our life that won't be quite as extreme. Mm-hmm. But just because we're now learning to work with that negative karma doesn't mean that the effects of that negative karma is just going to go away. In fact, the continuing negative karma is usually very helpful to us, just like injuring my knee a little bit, to start to teach us how to move in a different way. If we just get kind of let off the hook, it doesn't. There's no reorienting, and so that's really important. I think for people in this culture, especially if you have the habit of beating yourself up a lot about mistakes, which is good, very good chance you do because it's very strong in this culture, then you want to pay really special attention to that as its own karmic cycle. Mm-hmm. The way in which the kind of beating up yourself, finding the fault in yourself becomes its own karmic cycle. It's actually, I'm going to say this in a way that will not be so helpful if you heard it out of context, but I try to get it in another context. That itself is immoral. Mm-hmm. Which could just be another reason to beat yourself up more. You beat yourself up for beating yourself up for beating yourself. It's like a never-ending story. But to work with that very directly and say, look, this is not an issue of me being evil. There's something that needs to be received and unfolded or opened up in that pattern of me criticizing myself all the time. And that's the receptivity to compassion.
Lots more for me to.
Yeah.
I would just.
So, when I was younger, I kind of received the teaching of karma in a way that, to understand the bad things that happen to you, you're reaping some past karma from something you did bad. Yeah. As I've gotten older, I feel lucky that I've gained the perspective that some of the difficult things that I may have perceived in the past, I did something bad, so something bad happened to me. But now I can look back and see that actually some of that pain has actually helped me. It's actually, maybe people around me that did bad things that helped me avoid me not to make those choices because I saw that. So if you place that idea in the context of kind of the human mind managing and negotiating this idea of karma and making judgments about things that are happening or not happening, just with that small, larger perspective, do you not see that useful, or what's the way to think about that when we were talking about the paramitas that we're kind of in delusion? We're looking through this through delusion, but I've also seen medicine and having that perspective, so I'm just wondering your thoughts on that.
You bring up a very good point. It's easy to take the teaching of karma just as whatever happens to me is my own fault, and that's where all the learning is going to happen. And that is a strain of Buddhist teaching, and I think it has its own place. Basically, when things are kind of messed up, first, check out what's going on. That's a good place to start, right? But one of the really, it's kind of technical oftentimes, that this is a cosmological thing, people don't talk about it so much always, is karma is one of the types of cause and effect. Mm-hmm. There's 5 kinds, okay? And so in the traditional teaching, but really we could just say there's all kinds of cause and effect. Karma is one of them. And karma has to do with how it is that we hold our intention, what's the unfolding of our consciousness in these lives. So we could have lots and lots of bad things happen to us that don't have anything to do with karma. The way that we are with those things does have to do with karma. And so oftentimes we learn from horrible things, like the last thing that we'd ever want to say is you grow up with an abusive parent, that's your fault. You must have done something wrong in your past life, and that's why you were born into that situation. Misunderstandings of karma are fraught with this kind of way of talking about things in Buddhist culture and other culture, but it's really not Buddhism. That really, really is not Buddhism. It's a misunderstanding of Buddhism. And so when you hear that, say, my teacher told me that's a misunderstanding. We got to turn the wheel on that one a little bit. And the reason is because there's a subtler way of understanding it that's important. Because what you want to work with is not, I was in this difficult situation and that must have been my fault because I have the karma. That's not what the teaching of karma is pointing us at. What we want to do is say, oh, I was in this horrible situation. What was my intention in that horrible situation? And how did my intention, my reactions to those things change? And where are places that I am really, I got kind of small and tight within that situation? That's not my fault. It's not about fault. It's about karma. And so now I have to work with that. And I can see the places where maybe I lash out at somebody because I feel really, I'm sensitive in that place and I don't know what else to do because this thing comes at me and it kind of triggers me of this past experience. I want to work with that. It's not my fault that I was in a horrible situation, but how I am with it is. And so in that way, having that broader perspective, I think is absolutely necessary. Otherwise, we kind of get the rocket fuel for self-blame. And that's not really what the point is supposed to be. The other thing I would say about it is when I practice atonement, like in the formal sense, like Fusatsu, or on a daily basis in my reflecting, I don't give up easy. I don't just blame it on me. I think about I went through customs last week and I didn't exactly give an honest answer to that question of whether I had food. This isn't true, by the way. When I went through customs last week, I was totally clean. But there have been times, right? And so then there's a whole process like, well, what exactly did I say? What was the thing? Another question is, do I actually regret this? Because if I just say it because I think I'm supposed to, because it's labeled as bad, it's not really atonement. It's just me blaming myself so that I can kind of scoot underneath whatever the rule is, I think, that's there. Like, don't lie, which is a pretty good rule, right? But sometimes I almost scoot under that. And so what I don't want to do is get in a dynamic where I'm kind of blaming myself to be able to scoot underneath it. If I'm going to break it, I'm going to break it. And I'm going to say, bring on the karma. That's another part of the ethics within Buddhism is sometimes we choose to break something here, or we choose to do something which from a karmic standpoint is problematic over here because we're willing to take the weight over here. This is why conundrums like would you hide people who are being persecuted in your house and lie to the guard that came to the door? Yeah. I'm totally willing to take the karma of that lie. Yeah. But what Buddhism will say is there is karma in it. And that's the part is we're like, it's not my fault. I want to put it over there. There's no karma. It's like, no, there's karma. There's karma in it. But I'm willing to take it. And I know I'm going to have to work with it. So there's a lot of nuances like that. It's good. So please continue to discuss about karma vigorously. I think this is one of the most interesting topics in Buddhism. It also tends to ground things. And the grounding is quite helpful. And then the last thing I'd say is that there is a Fusatsu ceremony on Tuesday. And starts at 6:30, and we have a period of meditation and then a little adjustment for the ceremony, and then the ceremony happens. One of the main activities of the ritual is prostrations. And so you get to get familiar with the ground. Okay? And actually a prostration is one of the beautiful expressions of atonement, that you just release your body to the ground, and then you stand back up. The prostration is not just going down. Right? The prostration is the going down and is the coming up. And the yoga of that, the humility, is really central to Buddhist practice. And that freaks people out sometimes, where it's a little bit like, we're not so used to, maybe not so used to it. But if you can make your way to prostration, it's really just a wordless teaching.